I had been looking forward to the company's annual dinner for weeks, not because I loved office parties, I never did, but because this year, I thought, might finally mark something. A small recognition for all the late nights, the projects I'd taken on without complaint, the time I spent quietly fixing problems no one else noticed. I had imagined my name being called, a handshake, maybe a short, sincere thank you. That would have been enough. As I stepped into the grand hall that evening, the room buzzed with laughter and polite chatter. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across the polished tables, and my colleagues, dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses, smiled like they had rehearsed it for months. I took a deep breath, smoothing the creases of my blouse, and tried to quiet the nervous flutter in my chest. I had been told by my boss, Mr. Hollies, that there was a surprise announcement for one of us tonight. His words had been careful, almost teasing, like he was dangling a promise in front of me. I believed it, perhaps too easily. I trusted him. I had always believed in the people around me. When the CEO called the gathering to attention, I felt my heart tighten. Names were read, awards were handed out, polite applause followed each recipient. I clapped, smiled, nodded. And then it happened. Tonight's big promotion, Mr. Hollies announced, goes to my son, Daniel. The room erupted in applause, and my stomach sank. I froze, my hands tightening around the stem of my glass. Daniel, who had been with the company for barely a year, a son who hadn't carried any of the responsibilities I had, who had walked in and out of projects with casual ease, was getting the recognition I had worked for. And then Mr. Hollies looked at me. "With you, Emily," he said, a smirk barely concealed, "we want to recognize your participation." A small, shiny plaque was thrust into my hands. I remember its weight, heavy in my grip, heavier in my chest. It read, "Outstanding Participation, Emily Richards." I forced a smile, my lips trembling slightly, nodding as though this were some sort of joke, and the applause washed over me like a wave I couldn't escape. I could feel the laughter in the eyes of my colleagues, the polite claps that hid what they were really thinking. "Know your place," Mr. Hollies whispered, leaning slightly as if I were too close to the line I wasn't supposed to cross. His words burned more than any slap, more than any shouting ever could. I had been careful, diligent, trusting. And yet here I was reduced to a word I had never wanted to hear applied to me, insignificant. I slipped back into my seat, hiding my hands beneath the table. I wanted to cry, to scream, to run out of the room and never look back. But instead, I watched. I watched Daniel beam as though he had earned something, watched my boss sit back in his chair, satisfied, and watched everyone else around me cheer politely, not daring to meet my eyes. I remember the quiet in that moment, too, the tiny, unbearable silence between the applause, the whispers I could almost hear but couldn't. I realized that no one was going to say what I had wanted to hear, that I deserved this promotion, that my work mattered, that my patience, my nights spent finishing projects alone, were seen. They weren't, not by anyone who mattered, and in that moment a strange clarity settled over me. Pain twisted in my chest, yes, sharp and raw, but there was something else too, an understanding that trust, blind and unquestioning, was dangerous. That sometimes the people we admire most are capable of the deepest betrayal. That recognition from others, especially those who benefit from our loyalty, could be conditional, fleeting, cruel. I held the plaque tightly, letting the room blur around me. I let the words "Know your place" echo in my mind, not as an instruction, but as a reminder. This was not the end of my story. It was, perhaps, the beginning of understanding who I was, and who I was not willing to let anyone define me to be. I smiled again, carefully this time, deliberately, not the forced smile for the audience, but the quiet, internal one that promised I would remember this. That promised I would learn, that promised I would grow. And I realized, even as I sipped my untouched drink, that the night had already given me something far more important than any promotion ever could: perspective. The morning after the annual dinner, I woke up with a heaviness I couldn't shake. My pillow had soaked up the tears I refused to let anyone see, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked back at me like a stranger. The bright, capable Emily everyone else thought they knew had vanished for a few hours, replaced by someone raw, hurt, and uncertain. At work it was all the same. Daniel walked past my desk, smiling as though nothing had happened, humming lightly, completely unaware or perhaps uncaring of the storm he had left behind. My colleagues greeted me with faint nods, their expressions polite, but I could sense their discomfort. No one spoke about last night. No one dared to. I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. I forced a smile at the coffee machine when a coworker tried to strike up a conversation about the exciting news. I said, "Yes, congratulations, Daniel," and kept my tone light, neutral. Inside, a small flame of bitterness flickered, but I buried it. I could not, would not, let them see how much it hurt. Not yet, not while I was still figuring out what it all meant. At my desk, I stared at the plaque. Outstanding participation, Emily Richards. I laughed softly, bitterly. Participation, the word rolled around in my mind like a stone, heavy and jagged. For years, I had dedicated myself to this company with faith and loyalty. I had believed in teamwork, in fairness, in merit. And yet, here was my reward, a shiny piece of metal that might as well have read, "Try harder next time." I remembered the look on my boss's face, the way his eyes gleamed with satisfaction when he leaned in and whispered, "Know your place." Those words were a punch I hadn't been ready for. But strangely, they also awakened something quiet inside me, a whisper of understanding. This was not about me, not really. It was about him, about his greed, his fear of being overshadowed, his need to keep the spotlight on his family. I spent the next few days observing, quietly, silently. I watched the way decisions were made, the way favoritism shaped meetings and assignments. I noticed small lies, half-truths, subtle manipulations. I began to see the patterns I had never noticed before, blinded as I had been by trust and ambition. Daniel's success wasn't a coincidence. It was carefully constructed, and yet I didn't react. I didn't confront anyone. I smiled, nodded, completed my work, and kept my thoughts to myself. The hurt was mine alone. I realized something essential. Reacting with anger, with accusation, would only validate their expectation that I was petty, that I would bend to humiliation. I had to be stronger than that, stronger than their shallow recognition, stronger than their applause. At night, I would sit alone in my small apartment, replaying the dinner in my mind. I thought about the years I had poured into this job, the nights I had sacrificed sleep, the weekends I had given up to meet deadlines no one noticed. I thought about how easy it would have been to give up, to let bitterness consume me. And yet, in that quiet reflection, I felt something stir, a determination not to be defined by their approval or their disregard. It wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity, about understanding that my value wasn't determined by plaques or speeches. It was about learning to measure my worth by my own actions, my own ethics, and my own perseverance. So I smiled. I smiled at colleagues, at Daniel, at Mr. Holly's when our paths crossed. The smile was still forced, but it was no longer trembling with pain. It carried something else, quiet observation, patience, the beginnings of calm wisdom. I had begun to reclaim a part of myself they had tried to diminish. And slowly I noticed the world shifting, not dramatically, not with fireworks or announcements, but subtly. Doors I had ignored before began to appear. Opportunities I had overlooked were now visible. People who genuinely respected me noticed my diligence, my integrity, my restraint. I realized that sometimes silence, observation, and self-control could speak louder than any complaint or confrontation. By the end of the week, I understood something vital. Being hurt doesn't mean you have to stay broken. Trust once betrayed leaves scars, but those scars, if acknowledged, can also mark growth. They can remind you where boundaries are, what respect looks like, and how far you are willing to let others define your worth. The plaque still sat on my desk, gleaming in the fluorescent office light. It was a symbol of their attempt to diminish me, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt instructive, a quiet reminder that even in the face of betrayal, I could cultivate strength. Even in disappointment, I could nurture patience, and even in silence, I could begin to see the truth. Weeks passed, and the sting of the promotion ceremony lingered like a quiet shadow. I carried on with my work, meticulously, silently, my outward composure intact. But my mind had changed. I no longer looked at Daniel with envy. I looked at him with curiosity and, admittedly, a little pity. The cracks in his polished confidence were there if you looked closely. One late evening, I stayed behind to finish a report. The office was empty except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft click of my keyboard. I was lost in numbers and charts when I heard muffled voices from the conference room. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I realized it was Daniel and my boss, Mr. Hollies. I lingered near the glass wall, just far enough to remain unseen, but close enough to catch fragments of their conversation. She's been pushing harder than ever, Mr. Hollies said, irritation in his voice. It's annoying. Everyone's supposed to defer to Daniel. Maybe we underestimated her. Daniel replied hesitantly. She notices things we don't. She cares about the work. I froze, my heart raced, but I stayed hidden, letting the words sink in. Daniel was admitting something I had suspected for months. My contributions were real, substantial, meaningful. And my boss knew it, too. He had deliberately overlooked me, sidelined me, to make sure his son stayed in the spotlight. She's talented, yes, Mr. Hollies continued, a hint of grudging respect buried beneath his pride, but her place is, well, you know the rules. She can't get ahead of us. Rules. Of course, the invisible rules that favored family, connections, and image over merit, effort, and integrity. I had always suspected unfairness existed in the company, but hearing it in their own voices made it undeniable. I felt a surge of betrayal, sharper than before, but also a strange clarity. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't chance. This was conscious, calculated manipulation. I stepped back, letting them continue their private conversation, the quiet evidence of their dishonesty searing into my mind. And then something shifted. I felt a calm I hadn't felt before, not anger, not resentment, not helplessness. Just understanding. I realized that I had been measuring myself by the wrong standards. I had thought recognition, awards, applause defined success. But what they valued, their approval, their empty gestures, was never mine to claim. My worth had always been in the work itself, the integrity of what I created, and the people who genuinely respected it. Over the following days, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how quietly other colleagues admired my diligence, how clients commented on the thoroughness of my reports, how smaller projects I had led were quietly being noticed by higher-ups who had no stake in Daniel's success. These weren't loud, flashy accolades, but they mattered more than any plaque ever could. One afternoon, I found myself in the break room with Daniel alone. I didn't mention what I had overheard. Instead, I offered a simple, calm observation. I've noticed you're struggling with the Henderson project. If you want, I can walk you through some of my notes. He hesitated, clearly unsure whether to accept my help, but eventually he nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Thanks," he said. And in that single word, I realized the irony. By staying composed, by observing, by choosing discretion over confrontation, I had taken control of the situation in a way no outburst ever could. I began to understand a deeper truth. The quiet moments, the unseen efforts, the restraint, these were the real markers of strength. Daniel might have the title, the applause, the plaque, but I had clarity, respect, and an internal authority no one could take from me. By the time I left the office that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The betrayal still stung, yes, but it no longer defined me. It was a lesson, a mirror reflecting not my inadequacy, but theirs. And for the first time since that humiliating dinner, I smiled without effort. Not the forced smile I wore for the audience, not the polite mask for colleagues. This was a quiet, inward smile, a recognition that I had begun to reclaim myself, piece by piece. I didn't need the applause. I didn't need the validation. I only needed the truth, and now I had it. Weeks after overhearing that conversation between Daniel and Mr. Holly's, I had changed. Not in obvious ways that anyone else would notice immediately, but in ways that mattered most. I moved with purpose, spoke with intention, and carried a quiet confidence that no plaque, promotion, or whispered remark could shake. The next annual dinner arrived, and this time I felt different. The hall was just as grand, the chandeliers sparkling, the polite chatter filling the room. Colleagues greeted each other with laughter and small talk, but I was no longer anxious. I walked in deliberately, a calm steadiness in my step, and took my seat near the back. I didn't need to be at the center of attention. I simply wanted to be present. Mr. Hollis approached, as he always did, a faint smirk on his lips. I returned a polite nod, refusing to let him see that the sting of last year had faded into something stronger, composure. Daniel, as usual, looked eager, bouncing slightly in his chair, waiting for the spotlight he thought would come naturally. The CEO stepped up to the podium. The chatter in the room died down immediately, replaced by polite anticipation. I listened, careful not to let my thoughts drift. And then the words came that I had been waiting for, though not in the way I imagined. "This year," the CEO began, "I want to recognize someone who embodies the true spirit of this company, dedication, integrity, and consistent excellence, someone who has carried weight quietly, without complaint, and has earned respect not through titles or connections, but through their work." My heart skipped a beat. I looked up, scanning the room, and their eyes were on me, all of them. Colleagues I hadn't realized were observing me smiled subtly, acknowledging what they had long seen. "I am proud to announce," the CEO continued, "that Emily Richards will be taking on a new leadership role, overseeing key projects and mentoring younger team members. Emily, please come forward." The applause was genuine and this time, not hollow or obligatory. It washed over me, but I didn't let it rush me. I stood slowly, letting my calm certainty guide me forward. As I approached the podium, I caught a flash of surprise on Mr. Hollis's face and a brief hesitation in Daniel's eyes. It wasn't gloating. I didn't need it to be. I simply walked with dignity, knowing that recognition had come not from the loudest voices, but from the quiet, persistent work I had done and from the truth. When the CEO shook my hand, his expression was sincere. "You've earned this, Emily," he said softly, and I realized that those words carried more weight than any shiny plaque ever could. I returned to my seat, the award in hand, but I didn't feel triumphant in a loud, showy way. The satisfaction was internal, steady, and quiet. I had watched, waited, endured, and grown. And now, the the world had finally aligned with the reality I already knew. My worth was never dependent on favoritism, applause, or empty gestures. After the dinner, in the solitude of my apartment, I placed the small award on my shelf beside the old participation plaque from the previous year. I looked at them both, and for the first time I understood their meaning fully. One represented pain, betrayal, and the lesson of careful observation. The other represented validation, yes, but also patience, dignity, and the power of staying true to oneself. I smiled softly, quietly. I thought about Daniel, about Mr. Hollies, about all those who had doubted or overlooked me. And I didn't feel anger or a desire for revenge. I felt something far more satisfying, clarity. Boundaries had been tested, trust had been broken, and I had survived not by fighting noisily, but by observing calmly, by choosing when to speak and when to wait. I realized that true power, the kind that lasts, doesn't come from titles or applause. It comes from self-respect, from knowing your worth, from refusing to let the actions of others define you. It comes from patience, quiet intelligence, and the wisdom to recognize when to act and when to wait. That night, I finally slept without the tight knot of anxiety in my chest. The lessons I had learned, the growth I had earned through hardship, felt heavier than any award, and yet far more valuable. I had not only survived betrayal, I had transformed it into something that would carry me forward in life, in work, and in every relationship I chose to invest in. And in that stillness, I understood the deepest truth. Dignity is quiet, resilience is patient, and recognition, the kind that truly matters, is not given by others. It is claimed quietly, by the one who knows their own value.